You are standing in a marketplace roughly 4,000 years ago in the city of in what is now southern Iraq. A man in front of you has 6 goats. You have a bronze knife you want to trade him for 2 of them, but he does not want a knife. He wants barley. You do not have barley. You have a knife and a headache, because now you need to find someone who has barley and wants a knife, trade him for the barley, and then come back and hope the man with the goats has not already sold them to somebody else. This is the story economists have been telling for 200 years about how money began. Barter first, then money invented to fix barter's problems. It is clean, it is intuitive, it is taught in nearly every economics textbook on Earth. It is also, according to the archaeological and anthropological record, almost certainly false. So how did humans actually invent money? Not the theory, not the textbook fable. What actually happened in the actual dirt with actual objects that actual people used to represent value before anyone had ever seen a coin? The real answer is stranger than barter, older than markets, and it starts not with trade at all, but with debt. Let's start with the myth, because you cannot understand what money actually is until you understand what it is not. The barter myth traces back to Adam Smith, who wrote in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations that in the earliest stages of society, before money existed, trade was conducted through a clumsy, inefficient system of direct exchange. Smith never claimed to have observed this system firsthand. He assumed it, the way Enlightenment thinkers often assumed a state of nature they had never seen. And for 2 centuries, economists repeated the assumption as though it were observed fact. Then, in 2011, anthropologist David Graeber at the London School of Economics published a book called Debt: The First 5,000 Years, and he did something almost nobody in the barter myth tradition had bothered to do. He went looking for the barter economy Smith described. He could not find it. Not in the anthropological record of indigenous societies in the Americas, not in Africa, not in the Pacific. Graeber's argument was blunt. No society has ever been documented anywhere at any point in history that ran its day-to-day economy on pure barter between strangers. What anthropologists actually found in non-monetary societies was something else entirely: credit, memory, obligation. Think about what that means. For most of human history, you did not trade a knife for goats on the spot. You gave your neighbor a knife because he needed one, and he remembered that he owed you, and someday, maybe next season, maybe next year, he would show up with a share of his harvest, or help you raise a house, or give you a goat when you needed one. Nobody was keeping score with coins. They were keeping score with memory, in a community small enough that memory worked. This is Dunbar's number again, the same cognitive ceiling of roughly 150 stable relationships that shaped how humans organized bands, villages, and eventually states. Below that number, you do not need money. Everyone knows who owes whom. Debt is social. Debt is personal. Debt is remembered, not recorded. But memory has a fatal weakness. It only works between people who know each other, who expect to see each other again, who share a community small enough to enforce a promise through reputation alone. The moment you are dealing with a stranger, someone from another village, another language, someone you will likely never see again, memory collapses as a system. You need something else. You need a way to settle a debt instantly, completely, with no need for trust or memory at all. And that, it turns out, is the actual origin of money, not a solution to the inefficiency of barter, a solution to the limits of trust. So if not barter, what came first? The earliest evidence points not to markets, but to temples, and to something that looks at first glance like paperwork. In Mesopotamia, in the same Sumerian cities where writing itself was invented, roughly 3100 BC, archaeologists have recovered thousands of clay tablets from the temple and palace complexes of Uruk and Assyriologist Mark van de Meerop, working through this material, has argued that the earliest known monetary unit in human history was not a coin or a shell, it was a fixed weight of silver, called a shekel, used as an accounting standard inside temple bureaucracies to measure debts, rents, and obligations, long before any physical silver coin changed hands in a marketplace. You did not need to touch the silver, you needed to know how much of it you owed. The temple kept the books. Grain went out, silver value came in, and the whole system ran on trust in the institution, not on trust in a neighbor's memory. That is the deepest root of money. Not a thing, a unit of account, invented to make debt legible across strangers. And here is the detail that should stop you. Denise Schmand-Besserat, whose work on the origins of writing traced clay accounting tokens back to roughly 8000 BC, showed that these token systems, small clay shapes representing specific quantities of grain, oil, or livestock, existed for 5,000 years before anyone wrote a word of literature or law. Writing was invented to track debt. Money, in its earliest conceptual form, is older than the alphabet, older than any story ever recorded, older than any king's name we know. It began as a number attached to an obligation. Everything else came later. But an accounting unit locked inside a temple ledger is not something you can carry, and it is not something that works between two strangers who have never met and share no institution to enforce the debt between them. For that, you needed something physical. Something rare enough to be valuable and portable enough to travel, and across dozens of unconnected societies, independently, humans arrived at the same solution: shells.
Specifically, the shells of a small sea snail called Cypraea moneta, the money cowrie. Native to the shallow waters of the Indian Ocean, particularly around the Maldives, these shells began circulating as currency in China as early as the Shang dynasty, roughly 1200 BC. Archaeologists excavating Shang tombs have recovered cowrie shells strung together in bundles, buried with the dead as a marker of wealth. And here's the detail that tells you how deep this currency went into the culture. The Chinese written character for money, bei, is a direct pictograph of a cowrie shell. Nearly every character in the Chinese language related to wealth, trade, buying, or value still carries that radical today, a fossil of a monetary system that predates bronze coinage by centuries. You are looking at Bronze Age currency embedded permanently in a living language. Cowries did not stay in China. They traveled, by trade routes, by conquest, by sheer cultural imitation, across an almost unbelievable range of the ancient and medieval world. Anthropologist Jan Hogendorn and economist Marion Johnson, in their 1986 study, The Shell Money of the Slave Trade, documented cowrie currency circulating across West Africa, parts of India, and Bengal, where it remained legal tender in some regions into the 19th century. Why cowries? Because they solved the exact problem temple ledgers could not. They were small, durable, difficult to counterfeit, impossible to grow more of locally in most regions where they circulated, which controlled supply, and instantly recognizable by sight and touch across cultures that shared no language and no institution. A cowrie shell did not require you to trust a stranger's memory or a foreign king's authority. It required you to trust that the shell itself was rare and real. That is money doing something a debt ledger cannot, functioning between people with zero shared history. But shells, useful as they were, had a ceiling. You could not easily divide a cowrie into smaller units of value. You could not stamp a guarantee onto it. And as trade networks grew larger, as cities grew into empires, humans needed something that could be standardized, verified, and trusted at a glance by someone who had never met you and never would. That brings us to Lydia, and to a king most people have never heard of. Around 600 BC, in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now western Turkey, someone began minting small lumps of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, into standardized pieces stamped with an official design. Herodotus, writing more than a century later, credited the Lydians with being the first people to strike coins of gold and silver and use them in trade. Modern numismatic evidence drawn from coin hoards excavated at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus in the early 20th century broadly supports the claim. Under King Alyattes, and more famously under his son Croesus, whose name became a byword for wealth so absolute that English still uses the phrase rich as Croesus, Lydia refined the process. Croesus, ruling from roughly 560 to 546 BC, moved from unpredictable electrum alloys to separate pure gold and pure silver coins, stamped with the images of a lion and a bull, guaranteeing their weight and purity under royal authority. Think about what that stamp actually did. Before coinage, if you wanted to pay someone in silver, they had to weigh it, test its purity, decide whether you trusted you. Every transaction carried the friction of verification. A stamped coin collapsed all of that into a single glance: the king's face, the king's lion, the king's guarantee. You did not need to trust the person handing you the coin. You needed to trust the authority stamped onto it. That is the single most important leap in the entire history of money. Not the material, the guarantee. Coinage did not just create a new object, it created a new kind of trust, one backed by the power of a state instead of the memory of a community or the natural rarity of a shell. And the idea spread almost explosively once it existed. Within decades, Greek city-states across the Aegean were minting their own coins, each with a distinctive civic symbol: the owl of Athens, the winged horse of Corinth, the turtle of Aegina. A coin was not just currency, it was a tiny piece of political branding that traveled in your pocket and told everyone who handled it which government stood behind its value. By the time Alexander the Great's empire stretched from Greece to India in the 4th century BC, Alexander's coinage, minted at dozens of locations across 3 continents, functioned as a shared monetary language across an empire that spoke a dozen different tongues. You did not need to speak Persian or Egyptian to know what an Alexander tetradrachm was worth. The coin spoke for itself.
But coinage still had a physical limitation that no amount of clever stamping could solve. It was heavy, it was theft-prone, and moving large sums of it across long, dangerous trade routes was a logistical and physical nightmare. Which brings us to the next great leap, one that had almost nothing to do with metal at all, and almost everything to do with paper, trust, and the invention of the bank. The earliest institutions we might recognize as banks did not start in Renaissance Italy, despite what most popular histories claim. They started far earlier in the temples and palaces of Mesopotamia and Babylon. The Code of Hammurabi, carved onto a basalt stele around 1754 BC and now housed in the Louvre after its discovery by archaeologist Jacques de Morgan in 1901, contains detailed laws governing loans, interest rates, and the responsibilities of grain and silver lenders. Several of its clauses regulate what happens when a debtor cannot repay a loan taken from a temple or a private lender, including provisions capping interest rates on grain loans and silver loans separately. This is not an abstract legal exercise. This is banking law, written in stone nearly 3,500 years before anyone in Florence had opened a counting house. The temples of Babylon functioned, in practice, as the world's first proto-banks. They held deposits of grain and silver on behalf of merchants and private citizens, issued loans at regulated interest, and kept meticulous records on clay tablets of who owed what to whom. The institution people trusted was not a person, it was the temple itself, an entity that would have presumably outlast any individual, backed by the authority of the state and the gods simultaneously. That combination, an institution larger and more permanent than any single person's word, is the actual foundation of what a bank is. Not a building, not a vault, a trust structure big enough to outlive the people using it. The idea resurfaced and evolved for millennia through Greek trapezitai, moneylenders who sat at tables in the agora, through Roman argentari who took deposits and extended credit across the empire, and it eventually reached its most transformative form in medieval and early Renaissance Italy. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Knights Templar, of all institutions, ran something close to an early international banking network.
A pilgrim traveling from London to Jerusalem could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in England and withdraw an equivalent sum, minus a fee, at a Templar house in the Holy Land without physically carrying gold across a continent full of bandits. Historian Piers Paul Reed, among others, has documented how this system relied entirely on a network of trust between Templar houses, verified by sealed letters of credit rather than physical coin changing hands at every stage of the journey. And then, in Florence in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Medici family took the underlying logic of temple deposits and Templar letters and turned it into something recognizably modern. The Medici Bank, founded around 1397 by Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici, pioneered the double-entry bookkeeping system, refined from earlier Genoese and Venetian practices, and formally codified in 1494 by the mathematician Luca Pacioli in his treatise Summa de Arithmetica. Double-entry bookkeeping meant every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, forcing the books to balance and making fraud and simple accounting error dramatically harder to hide. The Medici also popularized the bill of exchange, a written instrument that let a merchant in Florence pay a merchant in London without either party ever touching the other's physical currency. Money, by this point, had almost entirely stopped being a thing you held. It had become a promise you could verify. That transformation from metal you carry to a claim you trust is the entire arc of monetary history compressed in one sentence, and it did not stop at Renaissance Florence. It kept going, further and further away from physical substance until the substance disappeared almost entirely. By the 17th century, the Bank of England, founded in 1694 to help finance a war against France, began issuing paper banknotes representing a promise to pay the bearer in gold on demand. The note itself was worthless paper. What gave it value was the same principle that gave a Lydian coin value 2,000 years earlier, an authority backing the promise. The King's Lion had become the Bank of England's letterhead. Same trust, different medium. And in the 20th century, that final tether to physical metal was cut entirely. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold, an event now known as the Nixon Shock. From that point forward, the world's dominant currencies were fiat currencies, backed by nothing except the trust of the people using them and the authority of the governments issuing them. No temple grain reserve, no gold vault, no cowrie shell dredged from the Indian Ocean, just an agreement held collectively by billions of strangers who have never met and never will, that this piece of paper, or now this string of digits on a screen, represents value. Think about what that means. The entire system rests on the same foundation it rested in Sumer 5,000 years ago. Not metal, not shells, not gold. Trust extended across strangers who you will never really know. 5,000 years later, we are still solving it. One tap, one transaction, one act of collective belief at a time.